Hey guys, Mike Hopper here. So for this week's screencast, I'm going to do hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. My number one resource that I used was our textbook, The Acute and Emergency Care and Athletic Training by Michelle Cleary and Katie Walsh Flanagan. I'm going to talk about hypertrophic cardiomyopathy because it's a pretty common cause of death in athletics. So share my screen here. All right. So again, it is leading cause of non-traumatic sudden cardiac death. We know that sudden cardiac arrest, if you read anything from Dr. Koss or from the Corey Stringer Institute, they talk about how sudden cardiac arrest is a leading cause of death in athletics. It's number one with brain trauma, exertional sickling, and exertional heat stroke, rounding up the top four. The four of those account for over 90% of all catastrophic death in athletics. And again, sudden cardiac arrest is at the top of the list. Again, we know that cardiac arrest happens once every 3 days in American schools. It's the leading cause of death in athletics, leading cause of death on school campuses. And that, again, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is the leading cause of sudden cardiac death. So, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is a common genetic heart disorder. We see it as much as 1 in every 200 athletes. Okay, we can also see that in 1 every 500 patients in our general population. Okay, so if you think about on our school campuses and whatnot, on average, you're looking at, probably all of us have at least a couple of kids who probably have, at least a little bit of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. They may not even know it. All right, we'll talk about that here in a minute. And so that's a, definite concern that we have to think about, knowing that, again, there's a higher percentage chance of, us having patients who have some sort of heart condition. And again, many of these, as the name sudden cardiac death indicates, we don't know about it until it happens. So hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, again, is a genetic heart disorder. So they're born with this. And, basically, you could sometimes think about that as a ticking time bomb of sorts, that you just don't know when something might happen. It's described as having an unexplained left ventricular hypertrophy. So that left ventricle is just larger than normal, and there's really not a known reason why that has occurred. Okay, this HCM can lead to ventricular fibrillation, which causes your heart to flutter and not appropriately and adequately pump blood. That can it could also lead to ventricular tachycardia, which causes your heart to race, which then leads to that heart failure. Okay. Presentation in athletics, like I said, it occurs once every 1 in every 200 athletes, roughly. So hypertrophic cardiomyopathy presents more often in start and stop sports like football and basketball. Not so much in your long distance sports, you're running, you're rowing, those types of things, but more, again, in football and basketball. Especially, they found that it occurs more often in our African-American population. And again, in football and basketball, one of the, probably one of the most famous cases, I guess you could say, of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is Hank Gathers. Hank Gathers died back in the early 1990s. During a basketball game. He actually collapsed twice in the same season. I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize. I I looked up Hank Gather's case here online. So I pulled this information off of his Wikipedia page. But I've seen video of his death actually before. You know, like I said, he died during the conference tournament. He collapsed. No AED was brought out. He was pronounced dead at the hospital, you know, shortly thereafter. It didn't say exactly, but I'm going to guess, you know, within an hour or so of his collapse in the conference tournament. You know, and again, those who know the Hank Gather story probably know that he collapsed during the conference tournament. What they don't know is that he had actually collapsed back in December of that year during a game. And he ended up, you know, seeing a cardiologist, and he was on medicine. He was on a beta blocker called Inderal, I think is how you say that. But according to the Wikipedia page, he didn't like the way that medication made him feel. And his cardiologist reduced that medication multiple times to try to get, you know, that minimal effective dose to where he was getting what he needed, but he wasn't getting so much that he had the side effects that he didn't like, right? It's also believed that he was not taking the medication on game days at all. So, you know, his stubbornness was ultimately, you know, part of his demise, unfortunately. But also the negligence of the university and the negligence of his cardiologist, which his family did sue and settled for a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, which even back in the 1990s, you know, multi-million-dollar lawsuits, a lot of money. But both of those groups probably would have been found negligent in his care. So, you know, again, one of those cases that I'm sure many of us have heard about, maybe didn't know that it was hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. But again, you know, one that was caught on video. And many people in the basketball world have heard about, because like I said, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is common in basketball. Okay. So signs and symptoms, typically these individuals are going to be asymptomatic, and they're not going to know what, that they have an issue. Okay. However, syncope, pre-syncope, chest pain, shortness of breath, and dizziness during or after exercise can be warnings. So, you know, you can say that they are asymptomatic, but some of these patients have reported, you know, the syncope and the chest pain and the shortness of breath. They may report those symptoms and not realize that they are you know, warning signs, right? And symptoms that they need to let their healthcare provider, their primary care physician or the cardiologist, you know that they have an issue. They may just, you know, brush that off as being normal athletic activity or anything like that. Okay. They also do have a potential for a heart murmur. This heart murmur can be made louder by the Valsalva maneuver. All right. So that's another potential sign that they may have an issue. You know, and typically, depending on the heart murmurs, that may warrant further referral to a cardiologist for further testing. So I think it's really important that we talk about screening for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. You know, all of us are familiar with the American Heart Association 14-point cardiac screening. You know, all of us have looked at medical histories time and time again for our athletes, I'm sure. This AHA screening is the most basic of basic, I think you could say. All right. But they're looking for a family history of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or dilated cardiomyopathy, in their family, because again, this is a genetic condition. So if a parent has it, it may be worth investigating further to determine if the genes were passed down to the kid. Family history of sudden death at a young age, I think is a really important point. Something that I talk about when I teach my sports medicine class, and we talk about family history of sudden death, and we talk about some of these cardiac issues. It's really important that they understand at a young age, right? And I think normally those medical histories put that at probably 50 years old, 40 years old, somewhere in there. Okay. Because like I tell my kids, if grandma kills over and dies at 85, yeah, it's tragic. It's sad, right? But the reality is that, death is inevitable at some point, right? And it could simply be old age. Okay. So grandma or grandpa dying at 85 is not something that they necessarily need to be concerned about. But if they have a parent, if they have an aunt or an uncle, somebody like that who dies in their mid 40s, okay, or in their 30s, or if they have a sibling who dies, at 15, 16, 18, 20 years old, whatever, then they probably need to be a little more concerned about that, right? So looking at that family history of sudden death at a young age, whatever that young is, all right. And then again, this heart murmur can be detected with a stethoscope. There's a lot of controversy. We'll talk on our next slide here about diagnostics, but there's a lot of controversy today about whether that 14-point American Heart Association screening is sufficient, whether that auscultation with the stethoscope is sufficient, or should we be doing more in-depth screenings, doing an EKG, doing an echocardiogram, those types of things in our regular population, okay, or in our general population. Should we be doing that at a mass scale? Okay, so hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is going to show up diagnostically two different ways. One in our EKG or our ECG. Okay, over 75% of patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy are going to have an abnormal ECG. They're going to have an inverted T wave in multiple leads, and they're going to have Q waves in their lateral and inferior leads. The echocardiogram is considered to be the gold standard for detection of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. However, it's still not perfect. Okay, so Dr. Berry did talk about in his screencaster this week about the Seattle criteria and false positives and things like that with the EKGs, and that's one of those things that a lot of people are balking at as to why we would go through the process of doing an EKG. I think the Seattle criteria, they've talked now about getting it down to about 2% false positives, which in my opinion is really, really good. Okay, and it tells me that if I have an abnormal EKG, there's probably something wrong, and I feel like I would want to figure out what that is. And an EKG is relatively quick, relatively simple. I think it is the future for us. However, it still remains cost prohibitive and time prohibitive, I think. The other thing that a lot of cardiologists balk at the idea of an EKG in our general population is the understanding how to read them And I've heard from cardiologists before that there just simply aren't enough cardiologists to go around to deal with all of the false positives and the true positives, right? And so they're not big on doing an EKG unless there are signs and symptoms that would warrant that referral and warrant that further investigation. We are actually offering it at our school this year. We're going to jump into heart screenings. We have a company, My Heart Check, which is out of Kansas City, that is going to come down to our school, and they're going to do an EKG and an echocardiogram for $149 a piece for our kids. So we're excited about being able to offer that to our kids. Hopefully we don't catch anything, but hopefully if we do, we catch it then and not on the field, right? So, the other important thing to think about is this differential diagnosis. Okay, so you get an EKG and it's abnormal. You get an echocardiogram and it's abnormal. Now we've got to identify, and we have to decide, is it hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or is it simply athlete's heart? Okay, because physiologically we are going to see some hypertrophy with exercise, right? Just like in our biceps, just like in our quads and our hamstrings. Okay, if we work out, we're going to see some hypertrophy. And the same thing with our heart. It's going to develop a little bit if we are working out. It's going to build up to those demands that we need it to build up to. So we have to understand, and this is where having a pediatric cardiologist who understands sports cardiology in our high school setting, understands our pediatric patients, to be able to read and differentiate between the two. Okay. And again, that's one of the major holdups across the country is, we can do the EKGs potentially, but do we have somebody to read them? And do we have somebody to actually treat that person and decide what this truly is or not? But so I want you to think about the athlete's heart compared to the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy in this type of a situation. Treatment for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, in the big picture, you're looking at medication. Okay, if they know they have HCM, they're going to be prescribed some sort of medication. They're gonna identify what that is. Like I said, Hank Gathers was on a beta blocker. Some of your high-risk cases often get an implantable cardioverter defibrillator or an ICD. Okay, we've heard of those before. All right. I would say, guess what? If you collapse, you're now high risk, right? And so, if I think that if Hank Gathers had happened in 2015, 2018, today, that December collapse, he would have gotten an ICD after the fact. Okay. In the 1990s, we may not have been at that point yet. Sorry, Jim, but most of us in the early 1990s when Hank Gathers collapsed, we're only a couple years old, if born at all. I hate to break it to you, Jim. So I think it's really important that we think about that. There's another case that I wanted to mention just briefly, and I don't know if for sure it was hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or not, but I think it's another good example from a cardiac perspective. There was a basketball referee out in Colorado this year who made the news, made social media after he collapsed on the basketball court, and the AED and the athletic trainer and some bystanders, saved his life. It was caught on video, as everything is today. Everything's live streamed. Okay, and they were able to catch it on the live stream in their gym, and so they have video of it. and then he was able to go back and meet the athletic trainer. But the ironic thing, and I think the thing that I want to tie back here is, again, he was high risk, but he was cleared to participate. He was cleared to officiate. 15 years prior, he also had collapsed while refereeing a basketball game. His life was saved then. He had an internal defibrillator or an implanted defibrillator put in. It failed, causing him to go into cardiac arrest again, this year during this basketball game, and his life was saved again. So he has yet another chance. And my guess is that next year he'll be back on the basketball court once again. But I just thought that was something I would share. So, those are all things that are after the fact, right? The medication, the treatment. So I want to talk just briefly here about the emergency response. Obviously, all of us as athletic trainers are trained in CPR. We understand that, so I don't need to jump into that, specifically. But obviously, because this primary prevention, or the heart screenings, the EKGs, the echocardiograms, are not going to catch everything, we also have to be prepared for this emergency response. Okay, so building our emergency action plans, having our emergency equipment. You can see in this picture here, Lindsay and I are very proud of the fact that we've taken steps. Fortunately, most of this equipment we've had. We did have a cardiac arrest on our campus 5 years ago, February 11th, 2017, where we did save the man's life, by the way. And that tends to be the stimulus to purchase this type of equipment. But fortunately for us, it wasn't a stimulus to purchase the equipment, but rather we already had the equipment in place, and it validated the need for the equipment, right? And so, these backpacks here are things that Lindsay and I carry on a regular basis. We take them everywhere we go for football, outdoor sports. They reside on the golf cart quite a bit. We travel with them. We had certain coaches that were there that day when that man collapsed, who, as long as they were coaching, they were pretty insistent on the AED being there wherever they went, that sort of a thing. So your emergency equipment in our backpacks there, we have the AED, we have our CPR supplies, we do have bag valve mask, and we do have portable oxygen. And then we also have our stop the bleed kits and stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, and some other emergency equipment in there. Like I said, I like the fact they're actually red. They're blue. Our school colors are black and white, so those items stand out quite a bit for us on the sidelines and such. And then obviously CPR training, having our coaches trained in CPR, having our CPR training and practicing that and doing those sorts of things are important. And then one last thing I wanted to talk just briefly about, the textbook talks about having the AED available for these cardiac conditions. Obviously, the faster you can get the AED applied, the better. We talk about 3 minutes from collapse to defibrillation, preferably, right? That's kind of our window. Okay. This here, so this is a study. So actually these are graphics of our campus, but down at the bottom you can see this is a study, radius of care in secondary schools in the Midwest. Are automated external defibrillators sufficiently accessible to enable optimal patient care? This was done by a couple authors. It's in the Journal of Athletic Training from 2018. They were looking at high schools in Ohio and Michigan. and they wanted to see how accessible AEDs were, how much of campuses were covered. Okay. Again, these are graphics of our campus. This is a study. I actually reached out to the authors when it came out back in 2018 and found out how they did their methodology, because I wanted to be able to replicate that here on our campus. All right. These are screenshots that I used from an app on my iPad from AED locations. So this first one here on the left-hand side, this AED is at our front desk. Okay, and then on this right-hand picture, this AED is in our by the bathrooms over here on this far side of our athletic complex. Okay, this blue dot that you see is actually about where our athletic training room sits. Okay, these are just 2 of our AEDs on campus. We have 15, but the study looked at walking, running, and on a golf cart. Okay, so you see, if you're running, how far can you cover, run out, run back, and in that defined time if you're walking. And so I worked to put this together. Like I said, these are just a couple of screenshots that I took a few years ago. And I tried to put it all together, and I never could get it figured out. But what I did see with the maps that we used was that our campus was 98% covered by AEDs. Okay, which means that 98% of our school campus was able to, you could run to the AED and run back to the patient within that allotted time frame. Okay. Actually, you could walk to those distances. As you can see, you're running, you can go all over our neighborhood. So, but I thought that was an interesting study. I thought the methodology of that was really cool too, to be able to see what that looked like. And I think that's something that, the rest of you may also appreciate and can kind of look at on your campus, and maybe that can help you justify additional AEDs in your facilities. So, but like I said, again, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is the leading cause of non-traumatic sudden cardiac death in athletics. And so, we're looking at that family history since it is genetic, and just kind of seeing how we can capture that beforehand, but also being prepared to deal with it in the event that it does happen. So I guess that's all I have for you for tonight. So have a good night, have a good week, and we'll see you in the discussion board.